I've shared my opinion previously about some of the problems with police use of force training. I thought I'd follow up here with an outline of what I'd suggest could be taught at police academies to make both the police and the people they're arresting safer, and for the arrest to be more effective and less likely to escalate to higher levels of force. I'm not expecting anyone to actually listen to this, and I understand that some of the things I'm requesting might have issues that I haven't thought of, or might be too expensive to implement and so on. But if you were to ask me to develop a curriculum to be taught at police academies, or perhaps only to a specialist unit within a police force agency, then here's my basic sort of preliminary outline of what I'd start with at least. And it would evolve over time based on training and results and feedback. And what I'm suggesting here would be taught alongside other things like their firearms training, weapons training. This is not about replacing other things, anything aside from the hands-on stuff. Keeping in mind, the purpose of a police arrest is to bring offenders before the justice system so that their guilt can be proven or disproven and punishment doled out based on decisions that are hopefully unbiased. The purpose of the police is not to punish people on the spot, so we want to minimise any harm and only use force in a reasonable and proportionate way during an arrest, and only when it's necessary. And this underpins everything we're talking about. Police do not have the same objectives as MMA fighters, self-defenders, or the military, and the training should reflect this. So if it was up to me, what I'd implement are 1.5 hour training sessions, 3 times a week for 6 months as part of the training at the academy. And yes, I think there should be at least 6 months at an academy before people are put out on the road. And this is about the amount of training that I would feel comfortable with in sending people out to perform arrests to reach a certain level of proficiency, a level I'd consider the bare minimum. After this video, if there's any interest, I can do another version that is much shorter, probably more realistic, like 10 to 20 hours of training, which I think is completely insufficient, but that seems like it's far more palatable, I suppose, for most academies and so on. As for the training itself, I like to divide fighting ranges into standing, clinch, and ground. And these can each be divided further into more ranges and positions, but students need to be able to develop an understanding of each basic range, how they work together, and what their objectives are at each range, so that they can transition between them depending on what their goals are, what the end goal is, which will often be taking them from standing to the ground to handcuff the resisting person. These concepts and broader principles are more important than what the specific techniques are. There are many different approaches from a technical perspective, but understanding how things are supposed to work more broadly means that if you're faced with a situation that you haven't received specific training for, you can improvise, you can work towards that broader objective, taking more incremental steps instead of just continuing to do more of the thing that isn't working. When something doesn't work and we're out of ideas, we tend to just do it harder and more. Pain compliance, for example, when pain doesn't work, the tendency is just to try to inflict more pain until you get the result that you want. And this is why I'm not a fan of simply having a list of a small number of approved techniques. They might not work for everyone. They might not be appropriate under certain circumstances that you haven't thought of. And it reflects a poor understanding of how fights work in reality, in my opinion, if you just give someone several approved techniques. So let's go over these ranges that I've been talking about, from standing to clinch to ground. For the standing range, we'd learn about safe distance and the reactionary gap. I've made a video about sucker punches, which looks at this in some detail, managing distance in the standing range, but it won't really internalize and understand exactly what a safe distance is without getting punched in the face a bit. So I'd have the students do some boxing, including sparring, for the purpose of understanding the punching range, not to try and make them good at boxing. They don't need to spar exceptionally hard and receive concussions, but they do need, in my opinion, to experiment with moving between different standing ranges and to feel ramifications of making mistakes and standing still in within punching range. Striking can be used where necessary, but staying within striking range and exchanging strikes should be avoided, and appointments like OC and taser used instead to prevent injuries. They should learn how to close the distance to clinch and stand safe, learning to nullify strikes and avoid getting hurt. Drills where one partner is striking to avoid the clinch and the other is trying to close the distance would assist with this. The drills would start, again, from different ranges and stances, even starting from the clinch itself. And once you reach this point, this is where weapon retention starts. Drills where students start wrestling from the clinch with wearing their training belts, duty belts, and they can try to take their weapons from each other. If you want to learn to defend against a certain attack or situation, you need to learn how to do the attack to be able to cause that problem and have your training partners be able to do that as well. They need to understand the different clinch positions and fundamentals such as head control, pummeling, underhooks, overhooks, arm drags, body locks, and all of this is essential for weapon retention also. Takedown should start with an introduction to a few basic body lock takedowns and things like the front head snap, the head control. They should know what a level change means, changing levels to provide access to the lower body for takedowns like a double and single leg, and the defense against that, the sprawl, the basic method to defend against takedowns. All this would mean they'd be spending a lot of time wrestling with each other, trying to achieve takedowns, take each other down, and take their weapons from each other. And I'd introduce the concept of what I'd call controlled takedowns. And this is about getting someone to the ground in a way that minimizes injury. And this will help students not only in training, that they're trying to protect each other from hitting the ground too hard, breaking their arms or whatever, and legs falling over. But the idea is to guide them to the ground, not throw them like it's a judo competition. And I know this can be done because I've done it against resisting people in work that I've done before. Don't do things like make them face plant into the ground when they could have been lowered there, especially if they're half your size. So being very cautious, very careful to avoid injuries. On the ground, learn how to achieve and maintain dominant positions, again, with weapon retention. There would be a lot of drills and grappling on the ground, both partners trying to gain dominant positions and escape bad positions. And a big one is there should be a lot of full 100% effort grappling on the ground where the training partners are trying to put handcuffs on each other. I'd like to see handcuffs developed for training just for this purpose, perhaps made of reinforced plastic or something like that don't need a key for release, like a recessed button or something, where people can just go for it and try to get these handcuffs on each other, and it's an easy release once the round's over. And then you have training where all of this is combined, where you're going from standing with strikes, being very careful, of course, to the clinch, takedown, to the ground, controlling positions on the ground, all the while avoiding getting hurt, getting punched. And then sessions where it's multiples, 2 or 3 versus 1, 2 versus 2, 3 versus 2. Learning how to do takedowns as a team. And this is something I've covered in a much older video. I feel this part is essential. The controlled takedowns I just mentioned are more viable as a team. It's easier to do that. And I'd possibly include figure 4, basic figure 4 locks like the Kimura key lock or Americana, or the chicken wing it's called in old catch wrestling, just for control on the ground. And it can also help with certain positions from the clinch standing up during weapon retention to prevent use of the offender's weapon. Handcuffing alone while standing is exceptionally difficult, and it's still very hard on the ground while you're doing it alone. Working in a team doesn't magically make it easy, but with assistance, it makes a massive difference. There would also be scenarios with confined spaces, and that's kind of the gist of it. Compliant drills are necessary to understand basic movements, drills with a compliant partner, but you don't learn how to actually use anything that way. You're just memorizing the movement. You have to spar, you have to wrestle, you need to have a resisting opponent, someone who is not letting you apply it the way you want to. So that you have to adapt, you have to use things in combination, set them up. Notice I haven't mentioned wrist locks, armbar takedowns, leg reaps, not really many specific techniques at all. I'd consider using something like wrist locks if the training was to extend far past 6 months. I'd be teaching that to more experienced people who are already very comfortable in these different ranges. Now, while I was thinking about this topic of coming up with my own sort of imaginary curriculum, I asked someone I know who instructs at a gym in Texas what they would teach if they could only demonstrate a couple of takedowns to police. Here's his gym. They actually have an offer where they will teach police for free if they buy a gi and show up to training. He recorded this video for me. All I asked for, like I said, were what would you show them in terms of a couple of takedowns? First, without any prompting, he went into talking about managing distance and how to close a distance safely. Then he showed 2 takedown methods which work in combination with each other, where when they resist one, you can move to the other. So he's putting them in context. He isn't instructing them in isolation, but one is a setup for the other. He also mentions head control, a kind of head snap variation, or moving towards it's like a guillotine choke position, but it's head control. And then he goes on to demonstrating a dominant position on the ground, the mount. So going from standing to clinch to ground. He's intuitively done that because he knows that you have to understand how it all works together. He didn't mention wrist locks. He didn't mention armbar takedowns. He's not trying to pin the arms on the ground while the body is thrashing about on the ground. And no techniques demonstrated in a vacuum with no context. He gave me a summary with clear goals from each range to reach the final objective. So what I'm asking for here is not crazy, unproven stuff. This is the one profession where people are asked to go out and get hands-on with offenders and take them into custody and do it with the minimum force necessary. And I really think that we aren't preparing them adequately in my country and other countries that I've seen. The public deserves better and the police deserve better.